The soldier stepped off the bus with hesitant footsteps. The cold morning air brushed against his face, carrying the scent of damp earth and chimney smoke. Winter in this town always arrived slowly, settling in piece by piece. Unlike the brutal shifts he had experienced on the battlefield, he took a deep breath. This was his home, or at least it used to be. He adjusted the worn-out backpack on his shoulder and started walking. Each step on the uneven pavement felt heavier than the last. He was no longer in uniform, but the weight of war still clung to him. The streets he once knew so well looked smaller, almost shrunken, as if time had pressed down on them. Or maybe it wasn't the town that had changed. Maybe it was him. He passed the old market where, as a child, he used to sneak apples into his pockets. The wooden counter was still there, dark and worn from years of use. The elderly shopkeeper, her face lined with age, still stood behind the register, shaking her head as a customer argued over the price of vegetables. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. He turned the corner and stopped in front of the barber shop. The glass window reflected his image, deep-set eyes, a face marked by invisible scars. The wooden door, once always open and inviting, was now shut. He wondered if old Elias, the barber who used to give him peppermint candies, was still alive. He walked on, his footsteps growing heavier with every block. Then, finally, he saw the street leading to his childhood home. His heartbeat quickened. Cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck. The house was still there, small, simple, its paint peeling at the edges. The front yard looked neglected, weeds overtaking what had once been neatly trimmed rose bushes. The curtains in the window were closed. He stood across the street, unable to move forward. It was as if an invisible barrier held him in place. He was home, but was home still his? He remained frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the house he had once called home. His breathing was slow, controlled, an old habit from years of training. But inside, everything was unraveling. Would she recognize him? Would she even want to? He clenched his fists, his nails pressing into his palms. The last letter he had sent was years ago. At first, he wrote often, always promising he would return. But war had a way of stretching time, swallowing months, then years, until letters felt meaningless. Had she waited for him, or had she learned to live without him? A gust of wind carried the faint scent of burning firewood. It smelled like home, like childhood winters spent wrapped in blankets while his mother made soup in the kitchen. His stomach tightened. He wanted to turn back, to leave before he could confirm what he feared the most, that he was nothing more than a ghost now, a name long forgotten. But he couldn't leave, not yet. He forced himself forward, one slow step at a time, until he reached the old wooden gate. The latch was rusted, just like he remembered. His fingers hovered over it, hesitating. Then, gathering every ounce of courage left in him, he lifted his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the quiet house, and then silence. His heart pounded as he waited. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, from the other side of the door, he heard the faint sound of footsteps. She was there. The footsteps stopped just behind the door. He held his breath. The knob turned with a soft creak. Then slowly the door opened, and there she was, his mother. She stood in the doorway, motionless, her frail hands gripping the edge of the door as if to steady herself. Time had left its mark on her. Her hair, once deep brown, was now streaked with silver. The lines on her face were deeper, her shoulders slightly hunched, but her eyes were the same. They swept over his face, scanning, searching. He could see the confusion flickering in them, the disbelief. For a moment, she looked past him as if expecting someone else. Then her gaze returned, locking onto his. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. It was as if she were looking at a stranger. His stomach clenched. Had he changed that much? The silence between them stretched, heavy and unbearable. He took a small step forward. "Mom." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. Her breath caught. Her eyes widened, and then something shifted. The confusion melted into realization, slow, painful, overwhelming. She took a step back, one trembling hand rising to her mouth. Her eyes filled with tears. A sharp breath escaped her lips, half a gasp, half a sob. Her body trembled as she clutched the doorframe, her knuckles white. He saw it all unfold in her eyes. Years of waiting, years of unanswered prayers, years of fearing this moment would never come. Her legs gave out beneath her. "Mom!" He lunged forward, catching her before she could fall. She felt so light in his arms, so fragile. Her body shook violently, her breath coming in short, broken sobs. She reached out, fingers trembling, touching his face as if she needed to confirm he was real. Her fingertips traced the scar near his temple, a mark of the war he had survived, but never spoken about. "My son." Her voice broke, the words barely escaping through her sobs. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had seen men cry before, on the battlefield, in the darkness of makeshift bunkers, when the weight of war became too much. But this was different. This was the kind of grief that had been buried for too long, finally breaking free. "I thought," she choked on her own words, shaking her head. "I thought you were—" She couldn't say it. She didn't need to. He knew. She had thought he was dead. Tears blurred his vision. His chest ached. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but he had never expected it to hurt this much. He held her tightly, his voice unsteady. "I'm here, Mom." A sob racked her small frame as she clung to him, years of silent suffering spilling out all at once. And for the first time in forever, he let himself cry too. She clung to him as if afraid he might disappear again. Her hands gripped the fabric of his jacket, her frail fingers pressing into his back. It wasn't just a hug, it was years of longing, fear, and broken hope, all wrapped into one desperate embrace. He held her just as tightly. For the first time since stepping off that bus, he felt like he was truly home. Her body trembled against his, but she didn't let go. Neither did he. The warmth of her touch, the familiar scent of her skin, everything about this moment was painfully real. He wasn't sure how long they stood there, but time didn't matter. She was whispering something, soft, shaky words muffled against his shoulder. "I waited. I prayed. Every day, every night." He closed his eyes, guilt tightening in his chest. He had left thinking he would return quickly, that the war would be just another chapter in his life. But war never ends as cleanly as it begins. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice cracking. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes red and swollen. "You came back." He nodded, unable to speak. Then she cupped his face in her hands, just like she used to do when he was a child. She studied him, as if memorizing every detail. "You've changed," she whispered, pain flickering in her eyes. He had, but so had she. And yet, beneath the years, beneath the scars, both seen and unseen, there was something that hadn't changed. Love. She pulled him into her arms again, holding him with all the strength she had left. And this time, he wasn't afraid to hold on just as tightly. They stood there, holding on to each other, neither willing to let go. No words were spoken, yet everything that needed to be said was already there, hanging in the air between them. She didn't ask where he had been. She didn't ask why he had taken so long, not yet. Instead, she held him tighter, as if trying to convince herself that this wasn't just a cruel dream. He felt her heartbeat against his chest, uneven and fast. His own matched its rhythm. There were so many things he could say. He could apologize again. He could try to explain. But none of it would erase the years he had been gone. None of it would bring back the time they had lost, so he stayed silent. And so did she. The world around them seemed to pause. The cold air, the faint rustling of tree branches, the distant sounds of life continuing on, it all faded into the background. For the first time in years, he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a man carrying the weight of the past on his shoulders. He was just her son, and she was just his mother. Slowly, she pulled away, just enough to look at him again. Her hands, still trembling, brushed his face as if trying to erase the distance between them. Her lips quivered, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence was enough. Because in that moment, there was nothing to explain. He had come back, and she had never stopped waiting. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Her eyes were still studying him, taking in every detail, as if afraid that if she blinked, he would disappear. Then in a voice so soft it was barely more than a whisper, she said it, "My son." The words trembled raw with emotion. She said them as if testing them on her tongue, as if unsure they still belonged to her. Something inside him cracked. He hadn't realized how much he had missed hearing those words. His throat tightened, and he swallowed hard, fighting the lump rising there. He had faced death, had seen the worst of humanity, had walked through hell and back, and yet nothing had ever broken him like this. He tried to answer, but his voice failed him. His lips moved, but no sound came. So he just nodded. Tears spilled down her face, but she didn't seem to care. Her hands found his again, squeezing them tight, grounding herself in his presence. Then, with a shaky breath, she asked the question that had haunted her for years. "Are you really home?" He forced himself to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm back, Mom." Her shoulders shook, and she closed her eyes, as if she had been holding on to those words for too long. Then she pulled him into another hug, her fingers clutching the fabric of his jacket, her breath hitching against his chest. And this time, he didn't hold back the tears. She held him for a long time, as if afraid that the moment she let go, he would vanish again. And maybe, deep down, he feared the same thing. But he was here. This was real. With a deep, shaky breath, she finally pulled away, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. She looked at him, searching his eyes, her expression shifting between relief and sorrow. "You must be cold," she murmured. It was such a simple thing to say, yet it carried the weight of years spent wondering if he was safe, if he was warm, if he was alive. He let out a small, breathy chuckle. "A little." She gave a short nod and stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. "Come inside." He hesitated for just a second before stepping over the threshold. The moment he did, a strange sensation washed over him. The house smelled the same. Wood, old books, a faint hint of coffee lingering in the air. Even after all these years, even with the cracks in the walls and the faded curtains, this place still held his memories. His mother closed the door behind him, sealing the outside world away. He took in the small living room, the couch, the wooden rocking chair in the corner, the framed photographs on the shelves. And then he saw it, a picture of him, much younger, in his old uniform. It sat on the mantel above the fireplace, untouched by time. His mother followed his gaze and let out a soft, trembling sigh. "I never moved it," she admitted. "I couldn't." Something heavy settled in his chest. He walked toward it, brushing his fingers over the frame, the glass cool against his skin. She had never given up on him, not even when the world had. Turning back to her, he managed a small smile. "I should have come home sooner." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time, she smiled too. "You're here now. That's what matters." For the first time in years, he believed that the past was unchangeable. The time lost could never be recovered. But standing there in the house that still held pieces of him, with the mother who had never stopped waiting, he realized something. The future was still theirs to build. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. After years away, he finally returned home. But now, a new chapter begins. And you get to decide what happens next. Choose an option and comment below. He stays and rebuilds his life. Should he stay with his mother, trying to make up for lost time and start over in his hometown? he leaves to start fresh somewhere else. What if he realizes this place is no longer home and decides to move on, carrying the past with him, but looking toward the future? A dark secret is revealed. What if he discovers a shocking truth about his past, something that will change everything? Comment your choice below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story.